Emma Grace had always lived in fragments. Fragments of dreams, fragments of canvases, and fragments of courage she pieced together every morning just to survive. Her tiny Brooklyn apartment, barely more than four cracked walls and a flickering light bulb, smelled of turpentine and stale coffee, its corners crowded by unfinished canvases that screamed of potential, stifled by poverty. She worked double shifts at an aging cafe where customers barely looked her in the eye, saving every tip for paints she couldn't afford, brushes she longed to replace and rent, that always arrived like a villain in the night. Her evenings were spent in Central Park, sketching strangers with aching fingers and a hopeful heart, trading beauty for coins and glances that faded too fast. Art was her language, but the world didn't speak it. Her passion had become a private suffering, a sacred ache she could no longer silence. That night, rain wept over New York like a warning, streaking down the apartment windows as thunder hummed like a distant grief. Emma stood by her closet, staring blankly at a thrifted velvet gown her roommate insisted she wear. "Just come," her roommate had said, eyes gleaming. "One night among the rich won't kill you." But Emma knew better. The wealthy didn't notice girls like her. Still, she gave in, slipped into the deep green dress that clung to her curves like a secret, pinned her golden hair into soft waves, and painted her lips red, not for allure, but for armor. The car ride to Manhattan felt like a time machine, carrying her further from her reality and closer to a life that had never been hers. When they arrived, the gala glimmered like a scene stolen from a fairy tale. The marble halls bathed in gold, every guest polished to perfection, sipping champagne and murmuring names she'd only read in headlines. Emma hovered at the edge of the ballroom, her vintage heels sinking into luxury carpet, feeling like a smudge on a masterpiece. Laughter floated through the air like perfume, hollow and rehearsed. Then suddenly everything stopped. Across the vast room stood James Alexander Hale, the untouchable billionaire known as much for his devastating fortune as for his devastating detachment. Black suit tailored to perfection, hair slick yet unruly, those piercing blue eyes scanned the crowd with indifference, until they landed on her. It was only a second, but the air between them shifted like the pull of gravity itself. Emma froze, unsure whether to look away or lean in. James didn't blink. His gaze didn't waver. In that suspended moment, a girl with paint under her nails and a man carved from ice stood locked in a silent exchange more powerful than any words. She felt stripped, seen, exposed, not for what she wore, but for who she was underneath. And he, the man who had built empires and buried emotions, looked as though someone had whispered a truth he wasn't ready to hear. Emma's heartbeat thundered in her ears, drowning out the string quartet playing softly in the background. Every insecurity she'd ever carried screamed that she didn't belong. Yet that look, that searing, unexpected look, held her there like a question that demanded to be answered. His jaw tensed, his breath shallow, and in the span of a breath, she had gone from invisible to unforgettable. The distance between them was filled with 100 eyes, but in that instant, they were alone in a room full of ghosts. Emma's throat tightened with something unnamed. She clutched her small clutch bag, unsure whether to flee or follow the strange spark lighting up the pit of her stomach. James took a half step forward, subtle but undeniable, his posture shifting from bored elegance to sharp focus. A waiter passed between them, breaking the spell, but not the pull. Emma turned away, needing air, her cheeks flushed with confusion, and yet she felt it. Something had begun, something reckless, beautiful, and uninvited. As she wandered toward the balcony, the city skyline greeted her like a witness. The wind kissed her bare shoulders, and she closed her eyes, trying to breathe through the chaos swelling inside her. Behind her, footsteps approached, slow, deliberate, inevitable. She didn't have to turn around to know it was him. She felt him, like storm clouds about to break. In a world built on distance and deception, something real had ignited. And in that moment, under chandeliers and stars, the lives of a billionaire and a struggling artist began to collide. Not with noise, but with silence loud enough to rewrite destiny. Emma didn't turn around immediately. she let the silence stretch, daring him to speak first, testing if the pull between them was as real as the chill crawling up her spine. The sound of polished shoes stopping just a breath behind her said more than words could. He was there, unannounced, uninvited, but utterly present. She finally turned, slowly, cautiously, and found him standing there with his hands tucked into his pockets. Not with arrogance, but restraint, like he was holding back something unruly inside him. His eyes weren't just blue anymore. They were curious, searching, scanning her face as though it held a map he couldn't stop reading. "You don't belong here," James said softly. Not as judgment, but almost like a confession. Emma raised an eyebrow, her sarcasm surfacing before her fears. "Thanks. That obvious, huh?" she replied, and that was the moment. The first flicker of a smirk threatened his perfectly sculpted lips. He extended his hand without explanation, a subtle gesture wrapped in command, and though every cell in her body whispered caution, her fingers still found his. The ballroom had returned to its lavish rhythms, but for them, it might as well have been silent. James led her to the center with confidence, yet gentleness. His hand pressed against the small of her back in a way that didn't claim her, just supported her. They danced, not gracefully, not seamlessly, but with a raw rhythm neither expected. Emma could feel his heartbeat through the fabric of his suit, and it wasn't cold. It was loud and unsteady, mirroring her own. "What do you do?" he asked, his voice low, like a secret not meant for the chandeliers above. "I paint," she answered without pride or shame, just honesty. "Not for money, for survival." His head tilted slightly, eyes narrowing. "And why do your eyes look like they've seen everything and still hope for more?" She blinked, caught off guard. No one had ever looked at her like this. Not through her, but into her. "Maybe because I've been invisible most of my life," she murmured. James's jaw tightened, and for a split second, his gaze wavered, not from disinterest but pain. "You remind me of someone," he said, almost too quietly to hear. "Who?" she asked, already knowing the answer was buried in places he rarely visited. "My brother," he said, voice heavy. "He died when we were 12. He wanted to be an artist too, but foster care didn't believe in dreams." The music continued, but the dance slowed, becoming a conversation of movement, of weight shared and burdens lifted wordlessly. Emma didn't pity him. She saw him, the boy lost behind the billionaire, the man who had never fully grown past the ache of that loss. "So, you built walls instead of paintings," she said, her voice unshaken. James gave a short breath, a sound caught between a laugh and a sigh, "and filled them with everything money could buy. Still empty." Emma's eyes didn't leave his. "Emptiness echoes louder when the house is bigger," she replied, and he stilled, as though her words hit someplace deep. He leaned in closer, not enough to touch, but enough that she could smell the subtle cologne clinging to his collar. Expensive, restrained, like everything about him. "You don't talk like the others," he murmured. "You don't listen like them either," she replied, eyes locked on his. There was tension, not the kind that ignites lust, but the kind that dares two souls to inch closer, to take off their masks without knowing what they'll find beneath. James looked around, as if remembering where they were, then back at her with a flicker of mischief. "Come see my view," he whispered, not as a command but as a challenge, and Emma's breath caught, not out of fear, but wonder. The air between them grew heavier with every second, filled with questions neither dared to ask out loud. What would happen next? What this night might become? And if the invisible thread now tying them together would snap or strengthen? Without answering, Emma nodded, small but sure, and let him lead her through the grand exit, away from the noise, the stairs, the expectations. As they ascended the glass elevator, lights of the city shimmered below like 1,000 unspoken dreams, and James stood beside her, silent, hands still in his pockets, but his eyes were full of noise. When the doors opened to the penthouse, she expected grandeur, but what struck her first was the stillness. No staff, no music, just space, tastefully restrained, artfully cold. But on one side, a floor-to-ceiling window opened up to the entire city like a living painting. "There's your view," James said. Emma walked to the glass, breath fogging slightly as she took it in. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "So why does it feel so lonely?" He didn't answer. He just stood beside her, both of them framed in light and silence. And for the first time, James Alexander Hale didn't look like a billionaire. He looked like a boy who'd been waiting far too long for someone to see the man behind the suit. The quiet between them settled like dust in a museum, soft but sacred, as Emma stood in awe beneath the cathedral of glass that wrapped around James's penthouse like a transparent crown. The city below blinked with a million tiny lights, like secrets whispered across Manhattan rooftops, each one holding a story neither of them had ever lived. Emma stepped forward, her heels clicking faintly on polished marble as she wandered through the space, not with the hunger of someone impressed by wealth, but with the curiosity of a girl searching for hidden truths. Everything was stunning, but sterile, an immaculate prison wrapped in elegance. Her fingers brushed across a sleek marble countertop that held no fingerprints, no crumbs, no signs of life. On one wall hung a black and white portrait of a boy with messy hair and laughter in his eyes, standing beside a younger version of James, smiling a smile that had long since vanished from his face. Emma paused, staring at it, reading the emotion buried inside its frame like a forgotten letter. She continued on, discovering a grand piano sitting in a sunken living area, untouched and gleaming like a monument to silence. Without thinking, she lowered herself onto the bench, her hands trembling slightly as they hovered over the keys. She pressed one, soft and hesitant, then another, and soon her fingers found a melody, haunting, fragile, familiar, a tune from her childhood that always made her feel like her mother was in the room. James turned slowly, caught in the spell of sound that suddenly made his home feel like it had a heartbeat. He didn't speak. He just watched her play, eyes glassy, chest tight, memories crashing against the dam he had so carefully built. When she finished, the last note hung in the air like a held breath. "No one's played that piano," he murmured, stepping closer, as if afraid the moment would shatter if he moved too fast. "Maybe it was waiting," Emma replied softly, her hand still resting on the keys. He sat beside her, close enough to feel the heat of her skin, but not so close to touch it, and the air thickened with unspoken things. They didn't look at each other at first, just stared ahead, letting the silence stitch a fragile connection between them. Then James spoke, slowly, as if unlearning how to hide. He told her about growing up in 7 different homes before he turned 13, about sleeping with his shoes on in case he had to run, about the older brother who shielded him until fate didn't. Emma listened, not with pity, but with presence, letting his words land without trying to fix or soften them. She shared her own truths too, about a father who left when she was 6, a mother who worked 3 jobs, and a childhood colored in crayons and eviction notices. The city outside kept glittering like a bystander, but time inside the penthouse melted. She laughed at his dry sarcasm. He smiled at her honesty. They moved from the piano to the couch, curled under a blanket neither of them remembered pulling over. They spoke of dreams they'd buried and the masks they wore in daylight. Emma confessed how her art was once a safe place, but had started feeling like a burden she had to justify. James admitted that success had become his armor, a shield against ever being small or powerless again. Hours passed unnoticed, the room growing dimmer as dawn crept up in delicate golds and grays. As the first light broke across the sky, painting their faces in warm hues, they sat shoulder to shoulder by the window, neither needing words anymore. Emma rested her head against the cool glass, her reflection staring back at her, softer now, more seen. James leaned back, his arm brushing hers, and the contact sparked something wordless. A recognition, not of attraction, but alignment. He turned toward her slowly, hesitated, then whispered the single syllable that held everything. "Stay." She didn't answer immediately, just looked at him, deeply, completely, as if weighing not what he said, but what he meant. And in her quiet gaze, he found the answer before she spoke. Emma nodded once, barely, but it was enough. That night held no hunger for bodies, only souls. No hands roamed, but hearts opened. The fire that flickered between them wasn't lust. It was trust, rare and vulnerable. They fell asleep side by side, not tangled in sheets but in the safety of truth. The city continued its endless hum outside, but inside that glass castle in the clouds, two broken people had finally found the beginning of something real. Not in touch, but in tenderness. And as morning poured over them like forgiveness, neither of them knew where this would go. But for the first time in a long time, they were no longer afraid of the next page. Morning light spilled gently through the towering windows, painting the penthouse in quiet gold. But the space beside Emma was cold, untouched, empty, silent in the kind of way that made silence scream. Her eyes opened slowly, blinking away the haze of sleep, and for a fleeting second, she thought James might be in the kitchen, making coffee, or leaning against the window like the night before. Thoughtful, tender, human. But there was no echo of him anywhere. No footsteps, no warmth, just the whisper of city traffic below and a folded note placed with meticulous care on the grand piano's lid. She approached it with trembling fingers, already sensing its weight before she read the words. You made the night unforgettable. I'm afraid I'm not ready for what you make me feel. There was no signature, no explanation, just distance dressed in politeness, abandonment disguised as vulnerability. The words hit harder than expected, not because she didn't see it coming, but because for the first time in years, she had dared to believe someone might stay. She stood in the center of the penthouse, no longer enchanted by its view or captivated by its silence. Now it just felt like a glass museum of another near love lost. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply gathered her pride, her purse, and her heart, and walked away with a spine straighter than it had been in years. Back in her apartment, surrounded by unfinished canvases and the clutter of dreams half-lived, something within her cracked open, not from pain, but from purpose. She didn't need closure. She needed color. The paintbrush became her weapon, the canvas her confession, and with every stroke, she poured the ache, the betrayal, the fleeting beauty of what could have been into pieces too raw to name. Days passed in a blur of blues, reds, and violent golds, each shade echoing a different memory of James. The way his voice dipped when he said, "Stay," the haunted look in his eyes when he spoke of his past, the way he made her feel like the only real thing in a world that felt counterfeit. Across the city, James sat in his study, blinds drawn, light dim, staring at a half-written message on his phone he couldn't bring himself to send. "I'm sorry I left." That's all it said. But his thumb hovered and his chest tightened, haunted by shadows older than Emma, deeper than he liked to admit. Memories clawed their way back, of an ex-fiancé with a perfect smile and hollow eyes, who used his name as currency, his love as leverage, until he learned to equate emotion with weakness. Trust had become a scar, not a gift. But Emma wasn't her, and that truth unsettled him more than he could process. His assistant knocked twice, quietly, before stepping into the room. "There's something you need to see," she said, sliding a crisp invitation onto his desk. A small local gallery was hosting an emerging artist's showcase, and taped beside the invite was a photograph of a painting, a striking, chaotic explosion of gold and stormy blue, titled Unspoken. It didn't need a signature. He knew. Emma's soul bled from that canvas like a letter he was never brave enough to write. For the first time in days, he stood, slowly, as if waking from a coma, heart pounding with something between dread and awe. He remembered the way her fingers danced over the piano keys, the way she looked at him like he wasn't broken, just lost. She had seen him, not the billionaire, not the brand, just the boy still mourning a brother, still building walls. He had walked away from her not because she wasn't enough, but because she saw too much. And now, as he looked at the photo again, James knew with crushing certainty that he had made a mistake. One his wealth couldn't fix, one his pride couldn't justify. The man who had spent a lifetime building empires had finally met something he couldn't control. the aftermath of walking away from the one person who made him feel human. And in that moment, as the city blinked unknowingly beneath him, James Hale realized he didn't just miss Emma, he needed her. Not for the light she brought to his life, but for the darkness she wasn't afraid to face. The realization hit James with such force that inaction was no longer an option. He left his penthouse that same evening, stepping out of his perfectly ordered world and into the unpredictable streets he'd long avoided, guided by memory and instinct alone. The first place he thought to look was the small cafe Emmy had once mentioned in passing, a humble spot on a quiet corner where hope brewed stronger than the coffee. When he entered, the scent of roasted beans and warm pastries couldn't mask the jolt he felt upon seeing her behind the counter, her golden hair pulled into a loose braid, her eyes focused on a sketchbook instead of the cash register. She hadn't seen him yet, and for a fleeting second he hesitated, not from doubt, but reverence. She looked different now, not hardened, but radiant, as if pain had carved space for purpose. When she finally looked up and their eyes met, her expression flickered, not with longing, but with guarded resilience. "You found me," she said flatly, wiping her hands on an apron smudged with flour and charcoal dust. James stepped closer, the room shrinking to just them. "I never stopped seeing you," he said softly, but Emma wasn't interested in poetry. "No," she replied sharply. "You saw me, panicked, and ran." Her voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed the bruise he'd left. "Was I just a mirror for your pain? A night of borrowed peace before you returned to your fortress?" Her questions weren't cruel. They were honest, and they landed with precision. James didn't defend himself with apologies or promises. "I left because you made me feel," he said, voice low, raw, not just happy, not just safe, real. "And I didn't know what to do with that." She folded her arms, unconvinced. "And now?" He stepped closer, carefully. "Now I know that leaving you was the coward's choice." Emma's lips parted, not in surprise, but in restraint. Part of her wanted to believe him, but trust wasn't a switch she could flip. "You don't get to walk in here and fix everything with a few words," she murmured. James nodded, accepting her resistance. "I'm not here to fix anything. I'm here to invite you." He pulled a sleek envelope from his coat, the edges hand-embossed. "I'm hosting an art exhibit. Not for the elite, for artists like you. For dreamers I used to ignore." She didn't reach for it, so he set it gently on the counter. "You opened something in me that night, Emma. I built walls my whole life. And you didn't just spend a night in my bed. You broke into my walls." Emma's breath caught, but she held her ground. "Don't romanticize what you ran from," she whispered. He didn't argue. "Just come, if you want." And then he left. The night of the exhibit arrived quicker than expected, and despite herself, Emma went. More for closure than curiosity. The gallery buzzed with unfamiliar faces and fresh ideas, and for a moment, she stood at the entrance, unsure if she belonged. But then she saw it, her painting, "The Night That Changed Me," front and center, lit like a sacred confession. Her breath hitched and tears welled, not because of the canvas, but because for once someone had listened. And not just to her art, but to her silence. Emma stood frozen in front of her painting, the one James had titled without asking, and yet somehow he had chosen the exact words she would have never dared say aloud. The hum of voices around her faded, and all she could hear was her own heartbeat pulsing in her ears. Not from nerves, but from a strange, rising realization. This wasn't just an exhibit, it was a turning point. Her gaze moved beyond the canvas to the people admiring it. Young artists with messy portfolios, teens gripping charcoal-stained sketchbooks, older women with calloused fingers, all gathered in a place that once would have turned them away. She turned slowly, scanning the room, and then she saw him. James stood across the gallery not as the unreachable billionaire, but as a man reborn, eyes soft, posture open, completely and entirely present. He wasn't surrounded by socialites or cameras, but by gratitude, by purpose. He made his way toward her, cutting through the crowd like gravity had its own compass. And when he finally reached her, the room somehow felt like it was holding its breath. This, he gestured around them, voice low but steady, isn't for you. It's because of you. Emma's breath caught, but he wasn't finished. You didn't just change my heart, Emma. You rewired it. Then in front of strangers who had unknowingly wandered into the most personal moment of his life, James reached into his coat and pulled out a small, leather-bound sketchbook, frayed at the corners from nights of use. Without flourish, he dropped to one knee, not with a ring, but with vulnerability, with reverence, with something more sacred than tradition. You stole my heart, he said, voice cracking just enough to reveal how real it was. But I'm not asking for it back. The crowd went still. Emma opened the book with trembling hands, flipping through page after page of her, laughing on the piano bench, lost in thought at the window, painting with her brow furrowed, crying when she thought no one saw. She looked at him, tears spilling freely now, not because he'd remembered her, but because he'd seen her, truly seen her, even in the quiet moments. You drew me? She whispered, barely breathing. Every night since you left, he replied. She fell to her knees too, not out of romance, but surrender, to the truth, to the love that had been growing all along. Their kiss came slowly, softly, not ignited by fire, but warmed by faith, the kind that doesn't beg to be dramatic, only to be believed. It wasn't about possession or promises. It was about recognition. The crowd faded into gentle applause, but James and Emma didn't hear it. They were in their own universe now, stitched together by every broken piece they had once tried to hide. Later that night, they stood on the rooftop of the gallery, wrapped in a blanket that smelled faintly of lavender and paint, the stars hanging above like old friends who had finally decided to show up. Emma leaned into James's chest, eyes closed, heart finally steady. He kissed her hair, not with urgency, but with reverence, as though she were something fragile he'd spent a lifetime searching for. No words were needed, not anymore. What they shared now was unspoken, unshakable. For the first time in both their lives, love didn't feel like a risk. It felt like home. The rooftop memory lingered like the scent of rain on pavement, subtle, unforgettable, as the months that followed unfolded in quiet, radiant wonder. Emma's once cluttered apartment had been traded for a sun-drenched loft tucked above a flower shop in a corner of the city where the streets still felt like stories waiting to be told. Paintings lined the exposed brick walls, not just hers, but pieces she'd collected from young, unknown artists, each one a testament to her rising success and her stubborn refusal to forget where she came from. Gallery shows that once brought nerves now brought standing ovations, and her art, once doubted, now spoke to collectors and dreamers alike, flying off walls before the exhibits even opened. But it wasn't the fame or acclaim that lit her eyes each morning. It was the simple joy of waking beside James, who had traded power ties for paint-stained hoodies, conference calls for chalkboards, building creative schools in neighborhoods where art had long been silenced. Their life together wasn't glamorous, but it was golden in a way no camera could capture. Morning coffee came with paint-splattered kisses. Evenings ended with sketchbooks instead of screens. They existed in a rhythm entirely their own, unhurried, unafraid. One foggy morning, Emma shuffled into her studio, sleep still lingering in her lashes, only to pause at the sight of something unfamiliar on her easel. A small canvas, unframed, painted with shaky lines and colors that bled into one another with charming imperfection. Two stick figures, hand in hand, beneath a sky full of scattered stars. Her breath hitched as she turned the canvas over. In James's handwriting, messy but earnest, it read, "Our first night was a spark, but every day since, that's been the fire." Her hand rose to her mouth, heart stammering as tears blurred the paint into softened edges. She turned, and there he was, barefoot, holding a mug, eyes full of every quiet promise he'd never needed words to keep. He didn't kneel. He didn't pull out a velvet box or cue a string quartet. Instead, he stepped forward and held out his hand, as he did the first time they danced, and simply said, "Marry me." No crowd, no pressure, just a man choosing love with the same humility he once feared it. Emma didn't cry because she was surprised. She cried because, somehow, This love had been waiting for them all along. She reached for him, trembling, eyes locked with his, and whispered through a broken smile, "You gave me the world, James, but more importantly, you made me feel like I was always enough." They kissed, slow and steady. Not a grand finale, but the kind of kiss that said this is only the beginning. Around them, the city stretched wide and endless. But in that moment, in that tiny loft filled with sunlight and second chances, nothing else existed. No doubts, no masks, just two hearts once lost, now found, beating in time. And as the day unfolded, as laughter replaced silence and hope outshined fear, the canvas remained on the easel, drying gently in the warmth of morning, a quiet portrait of a love that didn't burn out, but burned on. Fade out. Love won.